Welcome, brothers and sisters, to the Wednesday night service for Farmington Church of Christ, Farmington, Arkansas. We are glad that you're here, and we're glad that you're tuning in on these lessons on Psalms. And we are very glad to be bringing them to you. We hope in the next very few weeks to start having some live seated classes. So I know we all enjoy the dialogue that we can have together, expressing our opinions and learning from that. So stay tuned for that. It all depends on a lot of the current situation and whatnot, but we hope that that's going to happen soon. Well, this has been a challenging week for our country, hasn't it? It's been a lot of unrest and uncertainty going on, people doing things that are uncharacteristic. And many of us might be feeling a little down and frankly a bit bewildered by what we have seen, by it all. The news that we see is seldom good anymore. On top of the pandemic that is raging in our world, we have seen a strife in our country like we've never seen before. People doing things that are uncharacteristic. The bad news just seems to keep coming at us right and left. There's some health experts that say all this bad news that we keep getting isn't good for us. Obviously, the bad news isn't, but just our psyche, we're physically and certainly mentally. It's just not good for us. So some have suggested it might be good to just take a break from the news for a while, sort of a news fast for a little bit, and attempting to do that. I think if something that were to happen that was bad enough, we would hear about it anyway through some other means. But enough about that. Centuries ago, the people of Israel were concerned about news as well. They were worried too about wars and disasters and sickness. Certainly, during the time of David, maybe the death of their husband, the death of friends from being a soldier, being in the army. And that's why Psalms 46 is so relevant for us today. So if you want to open your Bibles to the book of Psalms, we're going to be looking at Psalm 46 today, at least part of it. It was written to give them and us, frankly, to some security in a world that is uncertain. So I think it's a very timely psalm for us to look at right about now. For most of their history, the children of Israel, they were never a real powerful nation. They were in constant fear of invasion by their enemies and being overrun. The land that they lived in was harsh. It was rugged, hard to scrape out a living on. They were at the mercy of the weather and the elements all the time. Floods, droughts, all those things. It turns out they just had very little strength on their own. So they looked for God. They looked to God for their security. And Psalm 46 is a psalm of confidence and trust for the people of God, even when things aren't going very good, even in times of trouble, when you're concerned and worried. So Let's turn to that book and do a little reading right now. Starting in verse 1 of Psalm 46. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth gives way, though the mountains be moved into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, though the mountains tremble at its swelling. Selah. The psalmist here uses metaphors. We've talked about that before. We've talked about graphic imagery to describe God. And how does he describe him in this psalm? Well, he talks about God as a refuge, a place of safety that we can defend from our enemies. God is strength for us, strength we need in times of distress. And thirdly, is always ready to help to those who need him. So those are comforting, descriptive ideas about God. In verse 2, we see the word therefore. And I always remember our sister Leah. If you see the word therefore, you better look why it's there for. Because of what we just said. In other words, looking back on the previous statement or verses, therefore, we will not fear. We will not fear. The psalmist then describes some events that are difficult to imagine for a lot of us. The earth giving way, mountains falling into the sea, roaring waters, surging and quaking mountains. You know, just some pretty scary stuff. The earth coming apart, so to speak. Well, what's the point? Well, the point, no matter what happens, trust God who's in control. Even in catastrophes like these that we could close our eyes and imagine happening, hopefully we'll never see them. So a good question. If God is in control, and he is, why didn't he just prevent disasters such as these? Well, this question's been asked for ages, and the way I make peace with it is to understand that God just doesn't work this way. Events like this are part of a natural process that he created that shape our earth. That's the way our earth is put together. It doesn't mean God isn't in control. Events so big and earth-changing might make you think the world is ending. Maybe not like in the psalmist here, but other things that happen politically and other things, like we're seeing today. Is the world ending? Well, the psalmist offers confidence that God is ever-present help to us for all of these things. Well, let's read on a little bit and get a better understanding of where the psalmist is heading with this. Starting in verse 4, there is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy habitation of the Most High. God is in the midst of her. She shall not be moved. God will help her when morning dawns. The nations rage, the kingdoms totter. He utters his voice, the earth melts. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. Selah. Well, here we're talking about Jerusalem, the city of God, and as we know, there is no river flowing through Jerusalem. The city water supply was Gihon, Gihon spring, and that spring has been flowing since before the days of Solomon. That's the water supply. So we know this poetry that we just read is figurative about the river. Remember in our study of Psalms 23 and how soothing and important a river of water is to humans. We need that imagery. The nations rage and kingdoms totter. The city of God remains secure. Sometimes catastrophic events happen and that cause great fear and uncertainty, and those things do happen. But even up to all the way up to the earth itself melting, which is unthinkable. But members of God's city should feel secure. Do you remember when David confronted Goliath in 1 Samuel? His name for God then was Lord of Hosts, which in those times meant Lord of Armies, hosts of men ready to do battle for him. Well, whatever happens here, we need to know that God is above all of it. We see another name in verse 7 of our text, and there it mentions the God of Jacob. Well, the original covenants with Abraham and later renewed with Isaac and Jacob were powerful and full of authority. The God of Jacob is our fortress, and that is there to symbolize safety and security from God. Well, let's continue our text reading starting in verse 8 this time. Come, behold the works of the Lord, how he has brought desolations on the earth. He makes war cease to the end of the earth. He breaks the bow and shatters the spear. He burns the chariots with fire. Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. Selah. Rulers, kings, nations, and kingdoms exist because of God. Mankind might think they are mighty and invincible, and that happens, doesn't it? Think they don't need God. Think they're powerful in themselves. Think they're mighty people. Guess what? They're not. They think they're strong and they're permanent. Guess what? They're not. Let's look over in Daniel 2, verse 21. It says there, he changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. So it says he sets up kings. He also takes them down. God brings wars to an end and destroys the implements of war. It's been mentioned in our text in Isaiah 2, verse 4. Let's look at that too. He shall judge between the nations and shall decide disputes for many peoples. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. If we believe in the Almighty God and his power, we must trust that someday there will be a peace that only God can bring. Right now, God is letting mankind do what mankind does, and we are an unruly, scrappy bunch. But there will come a day when he says, okay, enough of that. He gives us advice now, doesn't he? What does it mean to be still, as written in verse 10? Well, in one sense, it could mean that we all ought to spend some time quiet meditation. And that's always good. But look in verse 9, the preceding verse. If we look there, it means he's going to put an end to the fighting. He's going to put an end to our scrapping with one another. One day, God will bring an end to all warfare and all hostility. But for now, end the struggling and acknowledge that He is God on our own. He's given us advice that we should do that as a people. Well, troublesome times may be here right now. Life can be hard for those who faithfully serve God because we live on an earth that is full of iniquity and people doing things that they shouldn't. But we do have a source of strength that unbelievers do not have. Romans 8, verse 28. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, and for those who are called according to His purpose. Sometimes this is hard for us to see, particularly when it's happening. But you have to trust that it's real. The psalmist wrote about a river of blessing in Jerusalem. Centuries later, long time later, the Apostle John wrote in Revelation about a similar river in the New Jerusalem. I want to read about that in Revelation 22, verse 1. Then the angel showed me the river of the water of life, bright as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb, through the middle of the street of the city. Also on either side of the river, the tree of life, with its 12 kinds of fruit, yielding its fruit each month. The leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. Well, brothers and sisters, let's try to not get too caught up in the highly emotional arguments of this world that are going on just now. Know that we serve something much higher, a much higher calling, and there's something better for us. I hope that that is a comfort. I want to thank you for listening, and I hope everybody be careful and be well. Good night.